The year is 1945, April. The war in the Pacific has entered its final, most brutal phase. High above the Japanese home islands at 28,000 feet where the air is thin and deadly cold, a single Boeing B-29 Superfortress struggles through hostile skies. This is not where any bomber crew wants to be. Alone, vulnerable, separated from the protective formation that had crossed the Pacific just hours before. Inside the aluminum skin of this four-engine giant, 10 young American airmen face a reality that every bomber crewman dreads. They are isolated, damaged, and deep over enemy territory. The mission had started like dozens of others. A pre-dawn briefing in the Marianas. Charts spread across tables, showing the route to mainland Japan. Target photographs passed from hand to hand. The men had suited up in silence, each lost in his own thoughts, each knowing that statistically some B-29s would not return. Now, as afternoon light slants through the plexiglass dome of the bombardier's station, reality has become something far worse than statistics. The bomber belongs to the XC Bomber Command, the strategic air force that operates from tiny islands seized at great cost from the Japanese, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. These bases, thousands of miles from anywhere, serve as America's forward airfields for the systematic destruction of Japan's war-making capacity. Below the struggling superfortress lies Honshu, Japan's main island. From this altitude, the landscape appears strangely beautiful, a patchwork of green fields, gray cities, and the distinctive cone of Mount Fuji in the distance. But this beauty is deceptive. Those cities are scarred by previous firebombing raids. Black smoke still rises from target areas hit just hours ago. Anti-aircraft batteries dot the landscape like deadly flowers, their crews watching the skies with binoculars and rangefinders, waiting for stragglers like this one. The fuel gauges tell a grim story. The aircraft is bleeding aviation gasoline from punctured tanks. Engine number 3 runs rough, its cylinder head temperature climbing into the red zone. The intercom crackles with terse status reports. The pilot's hands are steady on the yoke, but his eyes constantly scan the instruments, calculating distances, fuel consumption, and the narrowing margins of survival. Then it comes, the call every isolated bomber crew fears most. Fighters. Fighters at 3 o'clock high. The tension that has gripped the crew since they fell behind the formation crystallizes into something sharper, more immediate. This is the moment when training meets terror, when young men who volunteered for the most dangerous job in the most dangerous war must prove whether they have what it takes to survive. The tail gunner swivels his twin .50 caliber machine guns, tracking movement against the sun. The ball turret gunner, suspended below the fuselage in his tiny sphere of plexiglass and steel, searches the lower quadrant. Little do these 10 men know that they are about to fight one of the most extraordinary defensive air battles in the entire history of aerial warfare. They cannot know that this April afternoon will become legend, that their names will be spoken with reverence in briefing rooms across the Pacific, that decades later, military historians will study this engagement as an almost unbelievable example of courage, skill, and determination. The Japanese fighters are closing fast now, small dots against the sky growing larger with terrifying speed. The battle for survival is about to begin, and it will be unlike anything these men have experienced before. They are about to discover that sometimes, when death seems certain, the human spirit can accomplish the impossible. To understand the desperation of this battle, one must first understand what the B-29 Superfortress meant to both sides in the Pacific War by 1945. This was not just another bomber. It was a revolutionary weapon system that represented the pinnacle of American industrial and technological power. The B-29 was designed from the outset to be a strategic bomber, capable of reaching Japan from bases thousands of miles away, with a wingspan of 141 feet and powered by 4 massive Wright R-3350 radial engines, producing 2,200 horsepower each. It could carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet without oxygen masks, a revolutionary feature that gave it an edge over most Japanese interceptors. But what truly made the B-29 formidable was its defensive armament. The Superfortress bristled with weaponry, 12 50 caliber machine guns and one 20 mm cannon distributed across 5 remote-controlled turrets plus tail guns. The gunners didn't sit behind their weapons as in older bombers. Instead, they operated them through sophisticated analog computing sites that could track multiple targets simultaneously. This fire control system, state-of-the-art for 1945, gave a B-29 B-29 crew, the ability to engage multiple attackers at once with devastating accuracy. By April 1945, these silver giants had become Japan's greatest nightmare. Night after night, week after week, waves of B-29s had been systematically destroying Japanese cities. The firebombing campaign, particularly the devastating raid on Tokyo in March that killed over 100,000 people in a single night, had demonstrated that Japan's wooden cities were defenseless against incendiary attack. The B-29 threatened not just Japan's war industries, but the very survival of the nation itself. In response, Japan had adopted increasingly desperate measures. The Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces, once proud and elite organizations that had dominated Asian skies, had been ground down by years of attrition. Their best pilots were dead, fuel was critically short, and American fighters, particularly the long-range P-51 Mustangs now escorting bomber raids from Iwo Jima, had achieved air superiority over the home islands themselves. Japanese interceptor tactics evolved to match this desperation. Aircraft like the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, and even older Mitsubishi A6M0s were modified with heavier armament, 30 Minners cannon that could down a B-29 with a single well-placed shot, but which were difficult to aim and had limited ammunition. Pilots were instructed to press attacks to point-blank range, accepting catastrophic damage to ensure kills. And then there was Tai-atari, the ramming attack. Western historians would later confuse these with kamikaze attacks, but they were tactically different. While kamikaze pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into ships with no intention of survival, Tai-atari pilots were supposed to survive their ramming attacks by carefully striking the bomber's tail or wing with a reinforced portion of their fighter, then parachuting to safety. In practice, survival rates were dismal, perhaps 10%, but the tactic wasn't officially suicidal. It was instead a calculated trade: one fighter and possibly one pilot for one bomber, and 10 American aircrew. The American crews flying B-29s over Japan understood these realities intimately. They knew that Japanese pilots were skilled, desperate, and willing to die to stop them. They knew that a lone bomber, separated from its formation, was the most tempting target imaginable. Easier to attack, harder to defend, more likely to be damaged already. They knew that the sight of a single superfortress limping home alone would draw interceptors like blood draws sharks. The crew aboard this particular B-29 were veterans. They had survived multiple missions over Japan, had seen other bombers explode in mid-air or fall burning toward the ocean, had witnessed fighters pressing attacks through their own formation's defensive fire. They were not naive about what being alone over Honshu meant. They understood, with the cold clarity that comes from experience, that they were in the worst possible tactical situation for a bomber crew. What they couldn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that they were about to set a record that would stand throughout the entire war. They couldn't know that their names would be entered into the official records with a number beside them that seemed impossible. 14 confirmed aerial victories for a bomber crew in a single mission. The precise moment when the first Japanese fighter committed to its attack run is lost to history, but the official time logs record that by 14:30 hours, 2:30 in the afternoon local time, the engagement was fully underway. By this time, radar stations along the Japanese coast had tracked the lone B-29 for perhaps 30 minutes, guiding interceptor units toward it like hunting dogs directed to wounded prey. The first fighters appeared as glints of metal against the sky, sunlight reflecting off polished aluminum and painted camouflage. They came from above and ahead, the classic attack position against bombers, diving from altitude to build speed, then pulling up to fire from below, where the B-29's defensive fire was theoretically weakest. But the designers of the Superfortress had anticipated this tactic, and the ball turret gunner, suspended in his transparent sphere beneath the fuselage, had clear fields of fire directly downward. The lead Japanese fighter, probably a Ki-61 Tony, though exact identification was impossible in the chaos of combat, came in fast and steep. Its 20 Miner of cannons began firing at perhaps 800 yards, well beyond effective range but psychologically intimidating as tracer rounds arced toward the bomber. The ball turret gunner let him come, tracking the fighter through his computing sight, waiting for the range to close. At 400 yards, he pressed the firing button. The twin .50 caliber machine guns opened up with their distinctive hammering roar, sending a stream of half-inch bullets toward the approaching fighter at a combined rate of 1,600 rounds per minute. The tracer rounds, every fifth bullet was a tracer, made visible red lines connecting the bomber to the fighter. The Japanese pilot held his course for another 2 seconds, his own cannon still firing, before the 50 caliber rounds found their mark. Strikes appeared along the fighter's wing route, small bright flashes where armor-piercing incendiary bullets tore through aluminum skin and found fuel tanks or ammunition. The fighter shuddered, black smoke erupted from its engine, and suddenly it was no longer attacking but falling, rolling inverted and plunging toward the earth 8 miles below. First blood to the B-29. But there was no time for celebration, no moment to acknowledge the kill. Already more fighters were positioning for their attack runs. The intercom erupted with overlapping calls. Fighter at 9 o'clock level, 2 more at 6 o'clock high. They're boxing us in. The pilot threw the damaged bomber into a gentle banking turn, trying to present the hardest possible deflection shot to the attackers, while keeping his own gunners' fields of fire clear. The second attack came from directly astern, where the tail gunner, isolated in his position at the extreme rear of the aircraft, separated from the rest of the crew by the length of the fuselage, commanded his twin .50 calibers. This was perhaps the most dangerous position on a B-29, the most exposed, the place where enemy cannon fire concentrated. The tail gunner watched the fighter grow in his sight, saw the flashes from its guns, felt the bomber shudder as 20 Meany shells struck home. He fired back, his hands steady on the controls despite the terror of watching death approach at a closing speed of perhaps 500 miles per hour. The fighter, this one appeared to be a EE-84 Frank, one of Japan's best late-war interceptors, pressed its attack with suicidal courage, flying directly into the tail gunner's defensive fire. The 50 caliber stream found it at 300 yards. The fighter's canopy shattered. Control surfaces flew apart. The aircraft snapped, rolled right, and disappeared beneath the bomber's tail, mortally hit. 2 down, but the attacks were intensifying now, coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The B-29's fire control system, sophisticated as it was, required human operators to coordinate their fire, to call out targets, to avoid wasting ammunition on fighters already engaged by other gunners. The intercom became a rapid fire exchange of targeting information, each gunner simultaneously fighting his own battle, while remaining aware of the larger tactical picture. A Zero, one of the older fighters that had opened the war with such devastating success but was now obsolete against modern American aircraft, attempted a high side attack from 10 o'clock. The top forward turret caught it climbing, tracked it through its attack run, and fired a long burst that severed its tail. The Zero tumbled out of control, its pilot trapped inside, unable to reach his parachute. 3 down now, but ammunition counters were dropping with alarming speed. Each 50 caliber gun had been loaded with approximately 500 rounds, about 20 seconds of continuous firing. The gunners were already rationing their fire, taking shorter bursts, making every bullet count, and still the Japanese fighters came on. The next attack wave hit from below and ahead. 2 fighters dove together, coordinating their run to split the defensive fire. The ball turret gunner engaged the left fighter, while the central fire control gunner took the right. Both fighters fired their cannon, and both scored hits. The B-29 shuddered as shells exploded against its skin. Metal fragments flew through the interior, and an oxygen line ruptured, filling one compartment with a dangerous hiss of pure oxygen. One spark could turn the entire aircraft into an inferno, but both gunners held their aim, walking their tracer fire onto their targets. The left fighter exploded spectacularly as a 50 caliber API, armor-piercing incendiary, round found its main fuel tank. The right fighter staggered under multiple hits, trailing smoke and fuel, and broke off its attack, diving away with one wing burning. Whether it would make it back to base was irrelevant. It was out of the fight. 5 confirmed kills now, perhaps 6. The crew barely had time to register this extraordinary tally. The air inside the bomber had become a nightmare environment, hot despite the altitude, filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder and hydraulic fluid, loud with the roar of engines and the hammering of machine guns and the metallic pinging of shell fragments striking aluminum. Some crew members had minor wounds from shrapnel. All were exhausted from the adrenaline, from the constant vigilance, from the knowledge that one mistake, one moment of inattention could be instantly fatal. And still the Japanese fighters came on, driven by orders, by duty, by the knowledge that their homeland was being destroyed, and this was their chance to strike back. They had encountered not an easy kill, but a fortress that fought back with devastating effect, and yet they pressed their attacks with a courage that transcended mere duty, with a willingness to accept death that the American crew could recognize even as they fought to survive. The situation was desperate, but it was about to become catastrophic. The nature of the battle changed in an instant that would be forever seared into the memory of every surviving crew member. It came without warning, without the preliminary maneuvering of a normal fighter attack. One moment the gunners were tracking targets, calling out positions, coordinating fire. The next moment, a Japanese fighter was coming straight in, and it wasn't pulling away. The right waist gunner saw it first. A Key 61 Tony, its engine screaming at maximum power, diving from 11 o'clock high. But something was wrong with its attack profile. It wasn't firing, its guns were silent, and it wasn't leveling out for a firing pass. The gunner's finger tightened on the trigger, sending a stream of 50 caliber rounds toward the fighter, hitting it repeatedly. But the damaged fighter didn't waver, didn't break off. It came straight in. He's ramming. He's ramming. The scream over the intercom lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then came the impact. The sound defied description. A shrieking, tearing crash of metal on metal at hundreds of miles per hour. The Key 61 struck the B-29's right wing approximately 15 feet from the fuselage, hitting at a slight angle that prevented the fighter from penetrating completely through the wing structure. Instead, it ripped a massive gash in the wing's leading edge, tore apart the No. 3 engine mounting, and sent fragments of both aircraft spinning away into the slipstream. The B-29 lurched violently to the right. The pilot fought the controls, feeling the aircraft trying to roll over, sensing the catastrophic damage to the wing through his hands on the yoke. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. Engine No. 3, already damaged, tore partially free from its mounting, held on only by its controls and fuel lines, windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. The wing itself, designed to carry the tremendous loads of high-altitude bombing, had been compromised. Fuel sprayed from ruptured tanks, forming a visible mist in the air that would ignite at the slightest spark. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot worked with the desperate efficiency of men who knew they had perhaps seconds to save the aircraft. The pilot held the yoke with all his strength, using rudder and aileron to counter the massive asymmetric drag. The co-pilot's hands flew across the controls, shutting down the damaged engine, activating fire suppression systems, adjusting power on the remaining engines to balance the thrust. In those terrible seconds, every man aboard believed they were dead. The tail gunner began reaching for his parachute. The bombardier whispered a prayer. The radio operator started broadcasting a distress signal, knowing it was probably futile but following training anyway. This was how bombers died over Japan, damaged in combat, falling burning from the sky, their crews choosing between burning to death or jumping to uncertain fates over enemy territory. But somehow, impossibly, the aircraft stabilized. The pilot had managed to arrest the roll. The wing, though massively damaged, was still producing lift. They were losing altitude, bleeding airspeed, but they were still flying. There was no time to feel relief, because at that moment, a second Japanese fighter began its ramming attack. This one came from the left rear quarter. Another Tony, or perhaps a Key 84 Frank. Identification was impossible in the chaos. It had clearly been damaged in its initial firing pass, trailing smoke and flying erratically. Whether the pilot had deliberately chosen to ram, or had simply lost control and struck the bomber was irrelevant. The result was the same. The fighter impacted the B-29's left rear fuselage, just forward of the tail gunner's position. The collision was less catastrophic than the wing strike, but in some ways more terrifying. The entire aircraft rang like a struck bell. The fuselage buckled inward at the impact point. The tail gunner felt his compartment twist around him, saw daylight appear through new gaps in the skin, felt his guns jam as their mounting was warped by the impact. The fighter's propeller, still spinning, bit into the bomber's aluminum skin like a saw blade before the fighter broke away and tumbled downward, disintegrating as it fell. Debris from both aircraft scattered across the sky. Bits of aluminum, lengths of wire, pieces of equipment, things that had been part of carefully constructed flying machines, and were now just wreckage falling toward Japanese soil. In the cockpit, every warning light that wasn't already illuminated came on now. The master caution panel looked like a Christmas tree. Fuel pressure dropping on multiple tanks, hydraulic pressure fluctuating, electrical system showing faults, and the flight characteristics had changed again. The tail damage was causing the aircraft to yaw and slip, requiring constant pilot input to maintain anything like straight flight. The co-pilot looked at the altimeter. They had lost 5,000 feet in the last 2 minutes. They were down to 23,000 feet now, well within range of Japanese anti-aircraft artillery. artillery. Below them, through the holes in the clouds, they could see Honshu, enemy territory stretching in all directions, hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly forces. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, steady despite everything. Damage report. All stations, report. The responses came back. Injuries, equipment failures, ammunition status. But what struck every man was that they were all still there. All 10 crew members were still alive, still able to respond. The bomber, impossibly, was still in the air, and the Japanese fighters were still attacking. There is a moment in some battles when the tide turns not because of any single event, but because of a shift in psychological momentum. For the crew of this battered B-29, that moment came in the seconds after the second ramming attack, when they realized 3 things simultaneously. They were still alive, their bomber was still flying, and they still had ammunition. The pilot made a decision that would determine whether they lived or died. Instead of trying to maintain altitude, which would keep them in the engagement zone with the fighters for longer, he deliberately pushed the nose down, trading height for speed and maneuverability. The B-29 began a controlled descent, accelerating toward 350 miles per hour, using gravity to add energy to the system. This was counterintuitive thinking. Every bomber pilot's instinct was to maintain altitude, to stay high where the air was thin and performance was better. But this pilot understood that altitude was worthless if they were shot down before they could use it. Better to descend, pick up speed, and use that speed to outrun or outmaneuver the fighters. The Japanese pilots, expecting the bomber to either explode or fall out of control, were momentarily surprised by this aggressive maneuver. That moment of surprise gave the B-29's gunners a critical advantage. They had weathered the worst the enemy could throw at them, including 2 direct ramming attacks, and they were still in the fight. Morale, which had plummeted during the rammings, surged back with desperate determination. "Come on, you bastards." The transmission might have come from any of the gunners. In the after-action report, no one could remember who said it, but it captured the mood shift perfectly. They had been fighting defensively, trying to survive. Now they were fighting offensively, determined to exact a price for every attack. The next Japanese fighter that made an attack run learned this lesson fatally. It was a Zero, probably flown by a young pilot with limited training, the kind of pilot that made up most of Japan's fighter force by this late stage of the war. He came in from high on the right side, diving steeply, perhaps expecting the B-29's right side guns to be damaged by the ramming. He was wrong. The top turret gunner, one of the most skilled marksmen on the crew, tracked the Zero from the moment it started its dive. He led the target perfectly, accounting for deflection and the fighter's speed. When he fired, it was a textbook gunnery solution. The burst lasted perhaps 2 seconds, 30 rounds total. The Zero's engine exploded, the fighter flipped inverted, and the pilot bailed out. One of the few Japanese pilots in this engagement who would survive. 6 confirmed kills now, possibly 7. But the crew wasn't counting. They were fighting, reacting, surviving. The dance of aerial combat had become instinctive. Spot the threat, track it, fire, shift to the next target. The turrets traversed smoothly despite damage to some systems. The gunners called out targets without hesitation. They operated as a single organism, a coordinated defensive system that extracted a terrible price from every attacker. Another fighter came in from below, a Key 84 Frank, one of the more dangerous opponents. The ball turret gunner engaged it at extreme range, firing short bursts to conserve ammunition. The fighter jinked and weaved, trying to spoil the gunner's aim, but the computing site compensated for the maneuvers. Hits sparkled along the fighter's fuselage. Its canopy shattered. It rolled away trailing smoke and crashed into a hillside 30 seconds later. 7 or 8 now. The number was becoming academic. What mattered was that each attack was being turned back, each fighter either destroyed or damaged badly enough to disengage. The Japanese were learning the hard way that this particular B-29 crew was not going to be an easy kill, but the attackers weren't giving up. If anything, the intensity increased. More fighters joined the battle, probably called in by radio from nearby bases. Some attacked individually, using superior speed and maneuverability to make quick slashing attacks before breaking away. Others attempted coordinated runs from multiple directions, trying to overwhelm the defensive fire. The tail gunner, isolated in his position, unable to see the rest of the aircraft, knowing only that he had survived a ramming attack that hit just feet away from him, found himself engaged with 2 fighters simultaneously. Both were were making stern attacks, the classic tail chase that should have been lethal for the bomber. But the tail gunner had the best position for stern defense, with twin 50 calibers that could concentrate their fire in a narrow cone directly behind the aircraft. He fired at the right-hand fighter first, giving it a short burst that forced it to break off its attack. Then he shifted to the left-hand fighter, which had closed to perhaps 400 yards. This pilot was either very brave or very desperate, holding his course despite the B-29's defensive fire. The tail gunner gave him a 3-second burst, about 30 rounds, and watched the fighter come apart in mid-air. The wings separated from the fuselage. The engine fell away. The wreckage tumbled downward. 8 or 9 confirmed, and still they came. A 0 attempted a head-on attack, the most dangerous approach for both fighter and bomber. Closing speeds approached 600 miles per hour, leaving perhaps 2 seconds to aim and fire before the aircraft flashed past each other or collided. The bombardier, manning the forward nose guns, engaged it. Both aircraft fired simultaneously. The bomber shuddered under hits, but the 0 took the worst of the exchange. It exploded in a ball of fire that the B-29 flew through seconds later, buffeted by the blast wave. 9 or 10 now, maybe more. In the chaos of combat, some kills might have been credited to multiple gunners, while others might not have been seen to crash. The official count would be sorted out later by intelligence officers reviewing gun camera footage and combat reports. Right now, all that mattered was survival. The Japanese attacks were becoming less coordinated now, more desperate. Some fighters were low on fuel, forced to break off and head for home. Others were damaged, trailing smoke or flying erratically. And some, perhaps having watched half a dozen or more of their comrades shot down, were simply losing their nerve in the face of this bomber's unexpectedly fierce defense. One more fighter made a determined attack from the left side, firing its 20 mm cannon at close range. The left waist gunner, wounded earlier by shrapnel but still at his post, engaged it with methodical precision. The fighter's wing root erupted in flame. It rolled over and dove vertically into the ground. 10 or 11 confirmed now, possibly 12. The exact count was impossible to determine in real time, but what was clear, impossibly, incredibly clear, was that this single bomber crew was winning their battle against an entire fighter force. The pilot checked his fuel gauges and navigation. They had descended to 18,000 feet, well below their optimum altitude but still high enough to be relatively safe from ground fire. They were heading generally eastward, toward the coast, toward the ocean, toward safety. The remaining Japanese fighters seemed to be breaking off, unwilling to follow the bomber out to sea, where they would be at disadvantage against any American fighters that might be patrolling. The final attack came almost as an afterthought. A lone Ki-61 Tony, perhaps flown by a veteran pilot who wanted one more chance at glory, made a perfectly executed high-side attack from 9 o'clock. He came in fast and precise, his guns firing in short, accurate bursts. The B-29 took hits along the left wing and fuselage, but the top turret gunner was ready. He had been tracking this fighter from the moment it began its approach, recognizing from its smooth maneuvering that this was a skilled pilot. He fired a long burst, longer than gunnery doctrine recommended, but he sensed this might be the last fighter they'd face. The burst caught the Tony perfectly, stitching hits from nose to tail. The fighter's engine seized. Fire erupted from its cowling. The pilot bailed out, his parachute blossoming white against the dark green landscape below. And then, suddenly, the sky was empty. The gunners traversed their turrets, searching for more targets, but found none. The battle was over. They had survived. The bombardier, trained to observe and record, looked at his watch. The engagement had lasted approximately 45 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat, where most encounters lasted less than 5 minutes. In those 45 minutes, this crew had fought off attack after attack, had survived 2 direct ramming collisions, and had shot down an almost unbelievable number of enemy aircraft. Ceasefire. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. All guns cease fire. Conserve remaining ammunition. In the sudden quiet, relative quiet anyway, with 3 engines roaring and wind howling through holes in the fuselage, the crew began to comprehend what they had just accomplished. They were alive. The bomber, impossibly, was still flying, and spread across the sky behind them. Across the landscape of Honshu lay the wreckage of at least a dozen Japanese fighters. They still had to make it home. They were still hundreds of miles from safety, flying a badly damaged aircraft with limited fuel, but they had passed through the worst. They had faced death in its most immediate form, and had prevailed through skill, training, courage, and perhaps a measure of luck that bordered on the miraculous. ridiculous. The journey home was just beginning, but the battle, the impossible, incredible battle, was won. The flight back to the Marianas tested the crew in different ways than combat had. There was no adrenaline now, no immediate threat to sharpen the senses. Instead, there was only exhaustion, pain from injuries, and the growing realization of how badly damaged their aircraft truly was. The pilot and co-pilot fought the controls continuously. The damaged wing created massive drag and lift imbalance, requiring constant trim adjustments and asymmetric thrust. Engine number 3, still hanging partially loose from its mounting, created additional drag and disturbed airflow over the wing. Every control input felt mushy and delayed. The aircraft wanted to fall out of the sky, and only the pilot's skill kept it flying. Behind them, the crew worked to stabilize their situation. The engineer calculated and recalculated fuel consumption, determining that they might, just might, make it to Saipan if they maintained current power settings and didn't encounter headwinds. The radio operator managed to raise friendly forces, transmitting their position and situation, requesting that rescue aircraft be standing by in case they had to ditch. The wounded were treated as best as possible with the aircraft's medical supplies. None of the injuries were life-threatening. Shrapnel wounds, burns from hot brass casings, a broken finger where a piece of equipment had broken loose during the violent maneuvering. But every man bore the invisible wounds of the experience they had just survived. The psychological impact of 45 minutes, when death had been a constant companion. As they crossed the coast and headed out over the Pacific, the navigator provided a course heading that would take them directly to Saipan by the shortest route. Fuel was too critical now to allow for any navigation errors. The pilot held the heading exactly, fighting the aircraft's desire to drift, while the crew maintained vigilance for any sign of further mechanical failure. Hours passed. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful in any other circumstances. The crew was silent now, each man alone with his thoughts, processing what they had experienced. Some would later report that during this flight home, they thought about the Japanese pilots they had killed, young men like themselves, fighting for their country, who would not be going home to their families. The radio operator copied weather reports and received vectors from air traffic control as they approached the Marianas. Other B-29s from the same mission had long since landed, refueled, and their crews were being debriefed. Word had spread that one bomber was missing, presumed lost over Japan. No one expected it to return. When the island finally appeared on the horizon, a small green dot in the vast blue ocean, several crew members felt emotions they couldn't easily articulate. Relief, certainly, gratitude, but also something else, a profound appreciation for being alive, for having survived, when by all logic and probability they should have died. The pilot radioed the tower. "This is Superfortress, requesting priority landing clearance. We are heavily damaged and low on fuel." The tower cleared them for immediate landing, alerting crash crews and ambulances. On the ground, personnel watched the approaching bomber with growing astonishment. Even from a distance, the damage was visible. The torn wing, the missing engine cowling, the holes in the fuselage that daylight shone through. The landing approach was probably the most difficult flying the pilot had done all day, with asymmetric thrust, damaged control surfaces, and the entire aircraft handling like it wanted to swap ends. Bringing it down safely required absolute concentration. The co-pilot called out airspeed and altitude. The engineer stood ready to shut down all engines on touchdown. The rest of the crew braced for impact, knowing that if the damaged wing failed during landing, they could still die after having come so far. The main landing gear touched runway with a screech of rubber. The B-29 bounced once, settled, and rolled out. The pilot applied brakes carefully, aware that the damaged aircraft might not track straight. They rolled to a stop on the taxiway, and the pilot finally released the controls he had been gripping for nearly 8 hours. "We're home," he said simply over the intercom. "We made it." Ground crews surrounded the aircraft as soon as it stopped. When they saw the damage up close, the massive rents in the wing, the buckled fuselage, the hundreds of holes from cannon fire and shrapnel, many stood in silent disbelief. Several mechanics would later state that they couldn't believe the aircraft had flown at all in this condition, much less made it hundreds of miles back from Japan. The crew climbed out slowly, stiffly, their flight suits stained with oil, hydraulic fluid, and blood. Many could barely stand after hours of tension and adrenaline. As they gathered near the aircraft, looking up at the machine that had brought them home, someone started counting the battle damage, the holes, the structural failures, the destroyed equipment, equipment. But what drew the most attention were the gun camera films. As the intelligence officers processed the footage from multiple cameras, as they reviewed the combat reports and correlated them with the visual evidence, a number began to emerge that seemed impossible. 14 confirmed aerial victories. The gun cameras showed fighters exploding, breaking apart, spinning out of control, crashing. The crew's reports, independently given and remarkably consistent, detailed engagement after engagement. Radar data from the mission confirmed the timeline and location. There was no doubt, no ambiguity. This single B-29 crew, in one mission, had destroyed 14 Japanese fighters. To put this in perspective, fighter aces, pilots who had achieved 5 or more aerial victories, were celebrated as elite warriors. An entire fighter squadron might be credited with 14 kills over several missions. But a bomber crew, in a single engagement, defending against continuous attacks while flying a damaged aircraft, had achieved what seemed statistically impossible. The official after-action report was filed within days. Several crew members were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of America's highest military decorations for aerial achievement. The pilot received recommendations for an even higher award. The mission became a case study at Bombing Command Headquarters, analyzed for lessons about defensive tactics, crew coordination, and the capabilities of the B-29's weapon systems. But for the crew themselves, the recognition and medals were secondary. What mattered was that they had faced the ultimate test of aerial combat and had prevailed. They had proven that training, discipline, and determination could overcome overwhelming odds. They had discovered reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. In the weeks that followed, as the crew was reassigned to different units or rotated home, they would occasionally see the damaged B-29 in the maintenance area. Mechanics were working to repair it, though many doubted it would ever fly again. The aircraft had become a symbol of American industrial might, of the resilience of the men who flew these machines, of the brutal arithmetic of strategic bombing where every mission extracted a cost from both sides. The war would end just 4 months later, in August 1945, after atomic bombs dropped from B-29s forced Japan's surrender. By then, this crew's mission had become legendary within Bomber Command, a story told to new crews as an example of what was possible, of how a well-trained, determined crew could accomplish the seemingly impossible. The story of this battered B-29 and its crew transcends the simple statistics of aerial combat. Yes, 14 confirmed kills is an extraordinary number. Yes, surviving 2 ramming attacks was almost miraculous. But the deeper significance lies in what this mission reveals about the nature of warfare, courage, and the human spirit. Consider what these 10 young men faced that April afternoon in 1945. They were isolated over hostile territory, flying a damaged aircraft, facing an enemy that was willing to die to destroy them. Every probability favored their death. Military analysts, examining the situation objectively, would have calculated their chances of survival as minimal. The logical outcome should have been 10 more names added to the casualty lists, 10 more families receiving telegrams expressing the nation's regret. But probability is not destiny. Mathematics cannot account for the human factors that determine outcomes in combat, the training that becomes instinct under pressure, the courage that emerges when there's no alternative, the coordination that develops between men who trust each other completely, the sheer determination to survive. That can push human performance beyond normal limits. This crew refused to accept the likely outcome. When the first fighters attacked, they didn't panic. They fought back with precision. When they were rammed the first time, they didn't give up. They stabilized the aircraft and kept fighting. When they were rammed the second time, they didn't abandon ship. They held together and continued to defend themselves. At every moment when surrender or death seemed inevitable, they chose instead to fight, to persist, to believe that they could make it home. Their story is also a reminder of the brutal nature of the Pacific War's final phase. Those Japanese pilots who attacked so relentlessly, who pressed their attacks to ramming distance, who accepted almost certain death for a chance to stop one bomber. They too showed extraordinary courage, even in a losing cause. They were defending their homeland against an enemy that was systematically destroying Japanese cities. Their desperation was born of watching their country being reduced to ashes, of knowing that each B-29 that survived might return to drop more bombs on their cities, their families. War reduces complex human experiences to simple statistics: missions flown, bombs dropped, targets destroyed, casualties inflicted. But behind every statistic are individual human stories of fear and courage, of loss and survival, of ordinary people forced to do extraordinary things. This mission, with its impossible tally of 14 fighters destroyed, represents just one such story among thousands. The men who flew this mission eventually returned to civilian life. They became businessmen, teachers, farmers, ordinary citizens pursuing ordinary lives. Most didn't talk much about their war experiences. How could they explain to people who hadn't been there what it felt like to fight for your life at 20,000 feet over enemy territory? How could they describe the chaos of combat, the terror of the ramming attacks, the impossible elation of survival? But among themselves, among the community of bomber crews who had faced similar trials, their story became legend. It represented the best of what these men aspired to be: competent, courageous, dependable under pressure. It proved that even in the worst circumstances, even when death seemed certain, properly trained and determined people could accomplish the impossible. The B-29 itself, that battered aircraft that somehow made it home despite catastrophic damage, was eventually repaired and returned to service. It flew additional missions before the war ended. After Japan's surrender, it was probably flown back to the United States, processed through a depot, and eventually scrapped as the military drew down its massive wartime bomber force. Its serial number exists in archives somewhere, though connecting that number to this specific mission would require detailed research. But the memory of what it accomplished survives. In military aviation history, in the records of Sixi Bomber Command, in the personal recollections recorded in books and interviews years later, this mission endures. It stands as a testament to what can be achieved when skilled people refuse to give up, when training meets determination, when ordinary individuals are forced by circumstance to achieve extraordinary things. High above Japan on that April afternoon in 1945, 10 American airmen proved that courage and teamwork could overcome even the most desperate enemy tactics. They proved that probability is not destiny, that machines are only as capable as the people who operate them, that the human spirit, when properly trained and motivated, can accomplish what seems impossible. This was just one mission among thousands flown during World War II, but it was also unique, a perfect storm of circumstances that tested a crew to their absolute limits and found that they possessed exactly what was needed to survive. Their story deserves to be remembered not just for the statistics, but for what it reveals about human potential in the face of mortal danger. The fortress that refused to die became a legend, but the real story is about the men inside that fortress, young Americans who found within themselves reserves of courage, skill, and determination that they probably didn't know they possessed until the moment they needed them most. Subscribe to We Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of battles won against impossible odds, of the human dimension behind the statistics of war. This is history not as distant facts and figures, but as lived experience by real people who faced real dangers and discovered real courage. Their sacrifice, their service, and their stories deserve to be remembered and honored.